On the night of February 8th, 1904, 10 Japanese destroyers slipped through the darkness toward Port Arthur. No declaration of war had been issued, no ultimatum delivered. The Russian Pacific Fleet lay at anchor, its crews celebrating at the Admiral's party, its searchlights sweeping empty water. At 12:28 a.m., the first torpedoes struck. The battleship Rettwiesen took one in the bow. The cruiser Pallada caught fire amidships. The pride of the Russian fleet, the Cesarevich, was crippled where it sat. 3 hours later, Japan declared war. The Russo-Japanese War had begun with a surprise attack that would echo 37 years later at another harbor, by another Japanese fleet, against another unprepared navy. But in 1904, this was revolutionary. An Asian power had struck first against a European empire, and won. 1904 was the year the global power structure cracked. For 500 years, European empires had expanded without serious challenge from non-European forces. They had the modern weapons, the industrial capacity, and the assumed racial superiority that justified their dominance. Japan shattered all three assumptions in a single night. But Japan's victory wasn't the only crack in the imperial edifice. In Southwest Africa, German forces would commit the 20th century's first genocide, establishing methods and ideologies that would culminate in the Holocaust. In the Atlantic, two ancient enemies would become allies, creating the alliance system that would turn a single assassination into a world war. In the Caribbean, America would claim the right to police an entire hemisphere. Every empire was discovering that maintaining control required escalating violence. And that violence was becoming harder to hide, harder to justify, and harder to sustain. The age of European invincibility was ending. The age of total war was beginning. The attack on Port Arthur violated every convention of civilized warfare. Nations were supposed to declare war before attacking. Diplomacy was supposed to precede violence. Honor was supposed to matter more than advantage. Japan ignored all of it, and that was precisely why it worked. Admiral Togo Heihachiro had done the mathematics. Russia had 7 battleships at Port Arthur, 6 cruisers, and 25 destroyers. But they were 5,000 miles from European Russia, supplied by a single incomplete railway with no possibility of rapid reinforcement. Japan had 6 battleships. They were concentrated and supplied from nearby bases. They were backed by an army that could be in Korea within 2 weeks. The Japanese also had something Russia lacked: unified command. Every Japanese ship, regiment, and artillery battery answered to the same strategic plan. Russia's army and navy barely spoke to each other. Japan's greatest advantage was psychological. The Russians could not conceive that an Asian nation would dare attack a European empire without warning. Even as Japanese destroyers approached Port Arthur, Russian officers dismissed reports of unknown vessels. Admiral Stark was hosting a party for his wife's birthday. Most of the fleet's torpedo nets were raised. Those ships that bothered to deploy them at all were unprepared. The attack lasted 10 minutes. Only 3 of 16 Japanese torpedoes found their targets. By any tactical measure, it was a mediocre performance. But strategy is not tactics. The 3 hits crippled Russia's 3 most powerful vessels in the Pacific. More importantly, they shattered Russian confidence. Admiral Stark was replaced. His successor, Admiral Makarov, tried to restore morale by taking the fleet to sea. On April 13th, his flagship hit a mine and sank in 2 minutes, taking Makarov and 635 sailors with it. The man who might have salvaged Russia's naval position was dead. The fleet retreated to port and never seriously challenged Japanese control of the sea again. The attack's impact went far beyond the military balance. For the first time in modern history, a non-European power had struck first against a European empire and gotten away with it. Across Asia, colonized peoples took notice. If Japan could humble Russia, what else was possible? Sun Yat-sen, in exile from China, immediately began recruiting Chinese students in Japan for his revolutionary movement. Indian nationalists started studying Japanese military organization. Egyptian intellectuals wrote essays asking why Japan had modernized successfully while Egypt remained colonized. The Ottoman Empire sent observers to study Japanese tactics. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II could not believe Japan had attacked without warning. He told his ministers that the Japanese were not civilized enough to observe European conventions. He was wrong. The Japanese were civilized enough to recognize that European conventions were designed to preserve European dominance. By breaking those conventions, Japan broke the spell of European invincibility. While Japanese torpedoes were shattering Russian illusions in the Pacific, German bullets were implementing something far more sinister in Africa. What began as a colonial uprising in January would become, by August, the template for mechanized murder that would define the 20th century. The victims were the Herero people. The method was systematic extermination. The precedent it set would lead, step by deliberate step, to Auschwitz. The Herero initially achieved stunning success. They killed 123 German settlers and destroyed isolated farms across German Southwest Africa. But this was not random violence. The Herero leader, Samuel Maharero, issued specific orders. Kill German men, but spare women, children, and missionaries. Do not attack the British or the Boers. This was targeted resistance against German colonialism, not racial war. Germany responded as if it were both. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had told his troops to behave like Huns in China during the Boxer Rebellion, sent General Lothar von Trotha to crush the uprising. Von Trotha had served in China and in German East Africa. His solution to colonial resistance was always the same: total destruction. The Battle of Waterberg. By August, 50,000 Herero, men, women, and children, had gathered at the Waterberg Plateau. They believed Governor Leutwein, who had been replaced by von Trotha, would negotiate. They were prepared to surrender their arms and return to their lands under German sovereignty. Von Trotha had different plans. On August 11th, he attacked with 1,500 soldiers, 30 artillery pieces, and 14 machine guns. But his intention was not to defeat the Herero in battle. It was to drive them into the Omaheke Desert, where they would die of thirst. The tactic worked perfectly. As the Herero fled into the desert, German troops sealed the border behind them and poisoned the water holes. Then, von Trotha issued his extermination order. Every Herero found inside German territory, with or without weapons, with or without cattle, will be shot. The laboratory of death. What happened next would echo through the century. The Herero who survived the desert were imprisoned in concentration camps. The Germans used that exact term, Konzentrationslager, for the first time. The worst was Shark Island, where prisoners were worked to death in freezing water, breaking rocks for harbor construction. Of 4,000 Hereros sent to Shark Island, 3,000 died. But this was not just mass murder. It was scientific mass murder. German scientists arrived to study the prisoners. They measured skulls, tested racial theories, and performed medical experiments. Dr. Eugen Fischer conducted research on racial mixing that he would later teach to Nazi doctors. His student was Joseph Mengelé's mentor. The camps became laboratories for racial science and extermination techniques that would reappear 30 years later. By 1908, 65,000 of 80,000 Herero were dead, over 80% of the entire population. The Nama people, who joined the rebellion later, lost 10,000 of their 20,000 people. It was genocide as government policy, executed with bureaucratic efficiency and scientific methodology. Germany kept detailed records. Photographers documented the camps. Scientists published their research in academic journals. No one tried to hide what they were doing because they did not think they were doing anything wrong. They were simply solving a colonial problem with modern methods, methods that would be perfected in Europe within a generation. As German soldiers were herding the Herero into the desert to die, British and French diplomats were signing papers in London that would ensure millions more would die a decade later. On April 8, 1904, they signed the Entente Cordiale, an understanding that ended 1,000 years of conflict between Britain and France. They thought they were preventing war. They were actually guaranteeing it would be global. The agreement was deceptively simple. Britain recognized French interests in Morocco. France recognized British control of Egypt. Both agreed not to challenge the other's sphere. It seemed like a colonial housekeeping arrangement, a bureaucratic tidying of African borders. Germany saw it differently. The Entente Cordiale meant Britain and France, who together controlled most of Africa, much of Asia, and the world's two largest navies, were no longer enemies. They were potential allies, and Germany was suddenly very alone. For 20 years, German strategy had depended on Franco-British antagonism. As long as Britain and France glared at each other across the Channel, Germany could dominate Central Europe without fearing encirclement. The German fleet could challenge British naval supremacy while the German army focused on France and Russia. The Entente shattered this calculation. Britain no longer needed to guard against France. France no longer needed to watch Britain. Both could focus on the growing German threat. The German battle fleet, designed to fight Britain alone, now faced the possibility of fighting Britain and France together. Kaiser Wilhelm II understood immediately what had happened. He wrote in the margin of the treaty text that the Entente is aimed at Germany. He stated that they must break it before it solidifies. His attempts to break it in Morocco in 1905 and 1911, in the naval race, and in the Balkans, would only drive Britain and France closer together. The Entente was not a military alliance. It contained no commitment to mutual defense, no combined war plans, and no integrated command structure, but it created the framework for all three. Within months, British and French military staffs were holding informal conversations about potential cooperation. By 1906, they were conducting joint planning. By 1911, they had detailed agreements about which British divisions would land where in France if Germany attacked. The transformation was remarkable. Nations that had fought at Waterloo, Trafalgar, and Quebec were now planning to fight together. The Entente had reversed 5 centuries of European geopolitics in a single document. When combined with France's existing alliance with Russia and Britain's coming agreement with Russia in 1907, it would create the Triple Entente, the alliance that would turn a Balkan assassination into a world war. While armies were bleeding in Manchuria and dying in the Omahique Desert, military bureaucrats in London and Washington were quietly building the administrative machinery that would make the next war unprecedented in scale. They were creating the command structures that could mobilize millions, move them across oceans, and coordinate their destruction with industrial efficiency. The South African War had exposed chaos in British military command. The Secretary of War did not speak to the First Sea Lord. The Commander-in-Chief of the Army reported to no one. India had its own military policy. The Dominions did whatever they wanted. When crisis came, no one knew who was in charge. The Escher Committee's solution was radical. They proposed to abolish the position of Commander-in-Chief entirely. They suggested replacing it with an Army Council modeled on the Board of Admiralty. They aimed to create an Imperial General Staff to coordinate strategy across the empire. They wanted to establish a Committee of Imperial Defense to integrate military and political planning. The reforms seemed bureaucratic, but they were revolutionary. For the first time, Britain would have a unified command structure capable of managing a global war. When 1914 came, the British Expeditionary Force would land in France within weeks because the machinery for its deployment had been created in 1904. The same structure that failed to coordinate in South Africa would successfully deploy millions across the empire. On December 6th, Theodore Roosevelt stood before Congress and rewrote international law. The Monroe Doctrine had warned Europe to stay out of the Americas. Roosevelt went further. America would exercise international police power in the Western Hemisphere. Any Latin American country that could not pay its debts or maintain order would find American Marines in its customs houses and American warships in its harbors. The logic was circular but effective. Latin American countries often defaulted on European loans. European powers would then threaten military action to collect their debts. To prevent European military presence in the Americas, America would take over the debtor country's customs houses and pay the Europeans directly. The debtor had no say in the matter. This was not traditional imperialism. America did not want colonies. It was something new, hegemonic imperialism. America would control Latin American countries' finances, their foreign policy, and their military forces, but would not annex them. They would remain nominally independent while being practically powerless. Between 1904 and 1934, American forces would intervene in Latin America 32 times. Each intervention was justified as preventing European involvement, maintaining stability, or protecting American interests. The pattern established in 1904, intervention without annexation, control without colonization, would become the template for American power projection worldwide. On May 4th, 1904, the United States formally took control of the Panama Canal project. The French had spent 20 years and 20,000 lives failing to build it. The Americans would succeed in 10 years by approaching it as a military. Operation. The Canal Commission was run by Army engineers. The workforce was organized like military units. The entire canal zone was governed under military law. This was not just a construction project. It was the embodiment of American strategic doctrine, the ability to move naval power between oceans without circumnavigating South America. When completed, the canal would allow the American fleet to redeploy from the Atlantic to Pacific in weeks instead of months. It would enable America to maintain a two-ocean navy with a one-ocean budget. It would make American power projection globally sustainable. The canal that began construction in 1904 would be ready just in time for the war that started in 1914. The Russo-Japanese War became a floating laboratory where every naval assumption was tested and most were shattered. The battles of 1904 did not just determine who controlled the Pacific. They determined how every navy would fight for the next century. At the Battle of the Yellow Sea on August 10th, something unprecedented happened. Japanese and Russian battleships engaged at over 8,000 yards, 4 times the expected battle range. Pre-war doctrine said naval battles would be fought at 2,000 yards, close enough to see your enemy's faces. The long-range gunnery was inaccurate. Only 1% of shells hit their targets, but that 1% changed everything. British observers immediately grasped the implications. Admiral Jackie Fisher, who would soon become First Sea Lord, began designing an all-big-gun battleship that could fight at maximum range. The result would be HMS Dreadnought, launched in 1906, which would instantly make every other battleship obsolete and trigger a naval arms race that would consume Britain and Germany. Every naval budget for the next decade would be devoured by the lessons of August 10th, 1904. The Japanese torpedo attack on Port Arthur proved something terrifying. Battleships costing millions could be sunk by destroyers costing thousands. A single torpedo, fired by a vessel 1/100th the size of a battleship, could send the pride of a fleet to the bottom. This mathematics haunted every admiral. Every navy began building torpedo boat destroyers, soon shortened to just destroyers, to protect their battle fleets. But this created an arms race within an arms race. By 1914, the British Grand Fleet would require dozens of destroyers just to leave port safely. The cheap torpedo had made the expensive battleship require an even more expensive protective screen. The mine that killed Admiral Makarov on April 13th demonstrated warfare's new reality. You could be killed by an enemy who was not even there. The mine cost £20. The battleship it sank cost £2 million. The admiral it killed was irreplaceable. By 1914, the North Sea would be carpeted with hundreds of thousands of mines, turning the ocean into a vast minefield where battle fleets dared not venture. The British Grand Fleet and German High Seas Fleet, the most powerful naval forces ever assembled, would spend most of the war hiding from weapons that cost less than a sailor's monthly wage. While the world focused on Japan's naval victories, the land battles in Manchuria were revealing something far more ominous. This was not the colorful cavalry charges and quick victories everyone expected. This was industrial slaughter on a scale that would become horrifyingly familiar 10 years later. At Liaoyang, from August 25 to September 3, 158,000 Russians fought 125,000 Japanese along a 40-mile front. Both sides had machine guns, quick-firing artillery, and telephone communications. For 9 days, armies the size of cities hammered each other with modern weapons. The result was 45,000 casualties and no decisive victory. The Battle of Sha Ho, from October 5th to 17th, was even worse. The front stretched 60 miles. Artillery barrages lasted days. Infantry attacks gained yards, not miles. Both armies dug trenches, strung barbed wire, and settled into positional warfare. Machine guns created kill zones no amount of courage could cross. Quick-firing artillery turned attacks into suicide. European observers watching from both sides sent back detailed reports. The Germans noted the effectiveness of machine guns. The French studied the importance of artillery. The British analyzed the use of entrenchments. They all drew the wrong conclusion, that Asian armies simply did not know how to maneuver properly. When European armies fought, they assured themselves that professional skill would restore movement to the battlefield. They were watching their own future and refusing to see it. Every element of World War I's Western Front was demonstrated in Manchuria in 1904. The trenches, the wire, the machine guns, the massive artillery bombardments, the futile infantry attacks, the staggering casualties, the stalemate. The only thing missing was poison gas, and that was only because no one had thought of it yet. The Russo-Japanese War proved something else. Modern war was won by railroads and supply ships, not courage and elan. Japan won because it could move 100,000 tons of supplies monthly across the Korea Strait. Russia lost because the Trans-Siberian Railway could only deliver 30,000 tons monthly across Siberia. Every general staff in Europe began calculating how many men they could mobilize, how fast they could move them, how much ammunition they would need, and how many trains it would take. The answers led to the elaborate mobilization timetables that would make World War I inevitable once started. Whoever mobilized first would have an insurmountable advantage. No one could afford to mobilize second. Every victory in 1904 created greater dangers for 1914. Japan's defeat of Russia would trigger the Russian Revolution of 1905. This would weaken the Tsar and make Russia desperate to restore its prestige. This desperation would lead it to support Serbia unconditionally in 1914. Germany's genocide in Southwest Africa established the precedent that civilian populations were legitimate military targets. The concentration camps, the extermination orders, the scientific racism, all would reappear on a vastly larger scale. The path from Shark Island to Auschwitz was direct and deliberate. The Entente Cordiale would lead to the Triple Entente, creating the alliance system that would turn a Balkan assassination into a world war. Britain and France, enemies for a millennium, would send their sons to die together in Flanders. America's Roosevelt Corollary established intervention patterns that would eventually bring America into European wars it had historically avoided. The canal under construction would allow American power to reach any ocean. The military reforms of 1904 created the command structures that would make mass mobilization possible in 1914. The naval innovations of 1904 started the arms race that would bankrupt empires before they fought. The weapons tested in Manchuria would make the next war a massacre. The leaders of 1904 thought they were solving immediate problems. Japan needed security. Britain and France needed stability. Germany needed living space. America needed control. Each solution created greater instability. In an interconnected world, every local victory created global consequences. 1904 proved that the age of limited colonial wars was ending. The next war would be total, industrial, and genocidal. The technologies, ideologies, and hatreds necessary for world war were now in place. All that remained was the spark, and the spark was coming. Korea was vital for Japanese security, a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan if controlled by a hostile power.